Good morning, all. Thank you for coming. This is the fifth talk in the series, and this one is on AI in sports, as you well know. And the last one will be next week. Don't forget that even though the main ILR course kind of ends this week, we started a week later due to the Jewish holidays. So we go 1 week further. So the last talk in this series will be next Wednesday. And that's on digital arts. AI and the digital arts should be very, very interesting. Today's speaker is Dr. Scott Nestler. He's a professor of practice in the Department of Sports Management at the University of Florida. He's a leading expert in sports analytics and decision science. His career spans the US Army, private sector consulting, and academia, including positions at Notre Dame, West Point, and the Naval Postgraduate School. He specializes in bridging the gap between advanced analytics and real-world decision-making in sports, helping teams and organizations gain a competitive edge through data-driven insights. At UF, he leads the Department of Sports Management, a national which is a program that is intended to elevate UF's presence on the global stage in sports performance, healthcare, and communication. This program fosters collaboration between academic units such as the Warrington College of Business and the University Athletic Association, helping bridge the gap between sports research and innovation and empowering students to address real-world challenges through data and AI. For example, the program offers opportunities to leverage technology and analytics for strategic decision in player acquisition, team formation, and in game decisions. We need all that, right? Beyond performance metrics, the program explores marketing strategies and revenue analytics, providing a well-rounded understanding of the field for students. So please welcome Dr. Scott Nestler.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I would like to make one minor correction or update to my biography. I do not actually lead the sport management department. My colleague, Kyriaki or Kiki Kaplanadu, is the department chair. I lead the sports analytics lab, not the department. I just want to be clear about that and not take credit for something else. Okay, well, we're going to start off here with a quick introduction, give you a little more about me beyond the formal stuff there. So go ahead to the next slide. So when I get asked, what do you teach? I have to think about what do I want the next, 15 minutes or hour of my life to be like? If I'm sitting on an airplane, do I need to be working on a paper or do I want to engage in conversation with my seatmate? And what I respond with might be different given that. Go ahead and build the slide. So one more. Sometimes I say I teach business statistics. That'll put the person next to me to sleep and I'm able to go work on what I want to. Sometimes in the past, I have said this next response, which is, I teach ethics in data and analytics, which I have done. I started a course sequence in that at Notre Dame until we were able to hire someone better prepared to teach it. That might get that's interesting kind of response. And then the last one, which is what I'm doing here at UF, is I say I teach sports analytics and their face lights up and they go, oh, wow, tell me more about that. So depending on the reaction I want to get, depends on what I respond with. Go ahead. So I call myself a pracademic. Over the course of my career, I've bounced back and forth between being a practitioner of analytics, data science, statistics, what have you, and being a faculty member, a professor. You can see there, and you heard earlier in the intro, a bunch of the different organizations that I have worked at over time. And I will say that at any one given point in my career, one or the other has been the lead role and the other one has been in a supporting role, but I think they're complementary and going back and forth has been a good thing for me. Go ahead. So let's talk about sports analytics. What is it and why is it hot in 2025? First off, I'm going to mention a few different fields. You see there sports analytics, which is this use of quantitative methods and data to measure and optimize team and athlete performance and strategies and minimize injury risk. It does not exist in a vacuum. It also is related to these other things like sports science, which is much more biomechanical and at the individual athlete level, which of course is then related to biomechanical engineering and applying, engineering and physics to human movement and figuring out how do injury mechanisms work and whatnot. And then strength and conditioning coaches who work with athletic teams have a role in here as well. So while I work with people from all of those fields, I mainly focus at the team level and on the strategy and tactics side of things, not down at the individual athlete level, although the data that we collect from those other fields is also useful in the work that we do. Go ahead. So this one might be a little hard to see. I tried making the text a little larger, but maybe failed, but I like conceptual Venn diagrams. And my point here is that these four fields are interrelated. There are overlaps between all of them, but at the heart of it, we're trying to optimize, both individual athletes and team performance. That's the goal of what we're trying to do. Okay, so here's a definition of sports analytics from about a decade ago from a book. Gil Fried, one of the first author, is a professor at the University of West Florida. And you can see here what he and his co-author said sports analytics was then. And let's focus on both what are the key parts of this definition and then maybe some questions or concerns we might have about it. If you go to the next slide, you will see that I have highlighted in blue, hopefully it shows up there as compared to the black, data, analytic models, information systems, informing decision makers, competitive advantage. Those are what I view as the key parts, the kind of the operative pieces of this. And by and large, this has held up pretty well for about 10 years. Next slide, you can see highlighted in orange a couple of words that maybe give me pause or concern. It talks about structured historical data. And 10 or 15 years ago, when I was first getting into this field, most of the data was structured. It was in tables, with rows and columns that you could put in an Excel spreadsheet, for example. And there's still a lot of that type of data that we use, but there's much, much more data that we use that is not structured. It's textual, it's video, it's audio, it's other things that we use. And I'll talk more about some of those new types of data here in a little bit. The other concern, The other concern I have here is this predictive word. Within analytics, there's generally like descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. Descriptive is kind of what we've been doing with statistics for a while, and then we've moved into prescriptive. But where we really want to get to, if you think about it, in making better decisions is the prescriptive part. So I would argue that we need to use descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive models in sports analytics, not just predictive ones. Okay. So here's a quote from the department chair of the sport management department at Rice University in Houston. He points out the fact that the sport industry brings in about $500 billion a year, which makes it one of the top 10 industries in the United States, which is one of the reasons that he and 4 other schools at this point have started undergraduate major programs in sports analytics. The other ones that have it are Syracuse, Akron, UNC Charlotte. Okay, I already mentioned Rice. What's the other one I'm missing? That's 4, but there's another one. There's 5 total. I'm trying to remember what the other one is. So anyway, it's a thing. Next slide. All right, if we think about use cases for sports analytics, I would separate it largely into 2 types, what I would call sport performance analytics, which is the area I primarily focus in, and then sport business analytics. And you can see there the 2 groups. And partially it's by who uses it or what are the use cases. So I primarily do most of my work for coaches and general managers and people like that, whereas people who do sport business analytics more so work for the ticketing, marketing, HR sides of the business. Another way to think about this is who uses sports analytics. And I show up here a cover from a book that I am the second author on. Wayne Winston from Indiana University, a professor emeritus, is the first author. And it's called Mathletics. But what I think is more interesting is the subtitle. Wasn't that often the case with books and papers? The subtitles where the meat of everything is, you know? But this one says what? How gamblers, managers, and fans use mathematics in sports. Well, it's not just gamblers, managers, and fans. It's also all these other people here, that use it. So keep that in mind. Depending what you're trying to do might depend on, who's the client or who's trying to use it. One thing I would like to point out is that problems in sports that can be solved with data and analytics often have analogs to other industries, other businesses. So like here on the left is a graph that was produced by Siemens, who make, diesel electric locomotives. And one of the things they were doing was they were saying, well, what's the probability this locomotive still works if we do perform, regular maintenance on it, or if we don't? And as you might expect, with your car or anything else mechanical, if you don't maintain it, it tends to not work. Well, it's interesting the way these curves work. And then that one on the right is actually what we call an aging curve that shows the performance of, in this case, a hockey player over the course of their career. Starting off in their late teens, early 20s, they tend to peak somewhere maybe in their mid 20s and then decline as, the growth and the peaking there is happening due to them learning more about playing at the professional level. And then the drop off there is as we get older and our bodies aren't as capable as they once were, we have to use our smarts a little more to stay competitive. But just one kind of parallel that I think can be drawn. There's many more I could use as examples. Okay, so if we look at what are the elements of sports analytics, this comes from a book by Ben Alamar. He says, if you want a sports analytics program at your organization, whether that be a professional team, a college athletics department, or even a private company, you need these kind of three components here, which are the data management, which lets us bring in, process, and organize our data, the analytic models that we're going to build based upon that, and then some information systems or some BI systems where we can provide routine results to the decision makers. But we also have to be ready for these ad hoc queries that come in from the decision maker, that maybe they're thinking about something in particular this week and they want to know something. So we have to be able to go, do a quick turn model to do that. So this is kind of the way that that most sports analytics programs are set up, with the idea that the main purpose of this is to help aid decision makers and leaders in making better decisions. Like I mentioned, the goals are typically save the decision maker time and then also provide them with information that they maybe aren't getting from other sources. One of the more difficult things I've had when I start working with coaches is to convince them, hey, I'm not here to do your job for you. I'm here to be another source of information, another input to your decision-making process. We have to figure out how to work together and do that. But it's an ever-growing input into leaders' decision-making processes. And most of them are not technical folks, and they don't need or want to know the details of the analytic models we're building, which means we have to be able to communicate to them, here's what it's doing in coach speak, in words they understand and trust and believe, and how they can use that without actually being able to dig into the inner workings. All right, so I mentioned data management, and this whole idea is to organize, centralize, and streamline data from multiple sources. You notice the photo up there for Hypergator, the supercomputer over on campus that we are using actually for a couple of our projects, and it's great to have so many CPUs, GPUs, and lots of fast storage available to us. I'll give you an example for one project that we recently completed for one of the teams. We actually brought data in from 7 or 8 sources that we combined into the models and the reports that we then provided to the team. So this idea of collecting and integrating data is huge. And as I mentioned earlier, data comes in different forms. It's both quantitative, numeric, tables like we think about, but it's also qualitative. We have textual things that have to be processed with natural language processing, for example. We have video. So for example, for the men's basketball team, we now have tracking data that is derived from videos. So from the broadcast video that we all watch when we watch the games, on television, computer vision is applied to those to generate where on the court are each of the 10 players and the ball at every point in time. Well, not every point in time, but anywhere from 10 to 25 times per second. So it's a fairly high frequency rate. And from that, we can build all sorts of interesting models. One thing I would point out is that there are lots of vendors in the sports tech space. One of my roles is to look at them to figure out what makes sense to use, what should we maybe consider adopting, but we also can't buy everything, and a bunch of it's just noise also. So part of my role is helping the teams figure that out. And getting the data right up front is as important or more important than the complexity of the models that you build. If the data isn't any good, no matter how fancy your model is, it's not going to provide good, useful insights. Okay, so what's the purpose of an analytic model? It's to take the raw data and translate it into, or transform it into, actionable insights or information. And I'm making the point there in the second bullet that data does not equal information. Raw data cannot be used by most coaches. They'll look at it and be like, yeah, I don't know what this is. What am I supposed to do with this? So we have to transform it into information, figure out what those meaningful connections are between all the different features or variables we have. And then, of course, what we care about is how can we help them understand how their players and their team are currently performing and how we might expect them to perform in the future, maybe especially against whoever the next opponent is, for example. The last bullet point here is important. Models can produce recommendations, but in my mind, they don't make decisions. Leaders still do that. There are some cases where perhaps due to the speed at which decision-making is required, perhaps we do hand some things over to the outputs of models, but generally speaking, most of the work I do, the models produce recommendations. It's still the coach's decision, do I challenge that call or not? The model might have said, yes, you should challenge this because doing so, has a 87% chance of success and would increase your win probability in this game by 4.5% or something like that. But it's the coach's decision. Where does he want to set the threshold for, do I listen to the model or not at that particular point in time, that day in that game? Okay. So I mentioned information systems or BI systems, business intelligence, and the goal here is typically to present information in an organized and clear manner. It is important that an organization have one version of the truth. We don't want to have different systems presenting different results. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have models that don't agree with one another, but we need to be clear about what each of them is providing. And if a decision maker is going to this system and then going to that system for answers and getting different results, then it's probably going to lead to some discussion. So we generally want to have one version of the truth. That doesn't mean groupthink, though. I'm trying to be a little nuanced about that. The other thing that's key here is having what I call interactive BI. In other words, although they're not analysts, they're not modelers, the coaches like playing with sliders and click buttons and whatnot and seeing, well, what if this, what if that? They like being able to interactively view the data and learn, what is this model trying to tell them? So we build a lot of what we call shiny dashboards for them to use. One of the key things is we want them to be able to use it in game at some time. So we make it so it's available like on an iPad where they can just tap and touch and drag sliders rather than having to type anything. Okay. A little bit more about information systems. Like we said, the goal is to give them access to information, let them make decisions to result in a competitive advantage. As I mentioned, dashboards are one way we do that. One of my professors in graduate school at the University of Maryland, he was in the human-computer interaction lab there, or he led that, Ben Schneiderman. He had this mantra about information visualization, which was overview first, provide the big picture, zoom and filter in on the part that you really care about at that moment. And then if you really want to go deep, details on demand, be able to kind of double click in and see what's really behind that. And I have found that taking this approach to most of our visualizations works very well. So that was one good thing I took out of grad school. Don't get me wrong, I learned lots of good things in grad school, but that's one that served me really well. Okay, using statistical models. One of the things that we have to be careful of is looking for those omitted variables, that thing that's not there, that thing that we didn't collect. So there's a famous example there with, in the summertime, we note that if we were to plot ice cream sales over the course of the year from January to December, that would increase through the spring, peak in the summer, and then decrease in the fall, right? Well, if we were to plot shark attacks, in either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, they would follow a very similar pattern. And, someone naively might look at that and say, hey, sharks like people who eat ice cream. No, that's not it. It's hot out, right? It's the temperature. It's that third variable that we didn't collect, or didn't have available to us. Well, we have the same kinds of things in sports. So like athlete performance in road games, it's generally seen that athletes perform better at home as opposed to an away game. Well, is that just because they're home or away? Well, not really. I mean, there's a whole lot more that goes into that, right? There's travel, there's sleep patterns, there's officials, believe it or not. That's actually the biggest thing between the home court, home field advantage is officials and reacting to the crowd. That's actually been shown to be a more significant effect than the sleep and travel piece of it. It's kind of interesting. We have to be aware that our sample that we have, the data set, could be biased in some way. And sometimes there's just spurious correlations that we have to think about. Anybody watch the World Series this past week? Yeah, okay. Anybody stay up and watch that 18-inning game? I did. Not intentionally. I was in Atlanta at a conference, and I went to bed early that night, actually. I went to bed, which is early for me. Normally I'm up about 11 or so. And then I woke up like 2 hours later around midnight. Not sure why. I think there was a train going by my hotel or something. And I woke up and I couldn't go back to sleep. So I turned the TV on to see what was on. And lo and behold, the baseball game was still on until 2:50 in the morning or whatever it was. But here's a spurious correlation. At least I believe so. Anybody know who played the national anthem at that game? Brad Paisley. He's a country artist. There was one other 18-inning game in 2018 in the World Series. Who played the national anthem at that game? Brad Paisley. There was a 14-inning game in I forget what year in the World Series. Who played the national anthem? Brad Paisley. I don't think it's the case that when Brad Paisley shows up to play the national anthem, it's going to be extra innings, but I would call that a spurious correlation, for example. Okay, one of the things that I try to get across to my students who are analysts in my lab, and I'll talk more about that here in a little bit, is you can't just always look at the average, the expected value. We have to look at the whole distribution of outcomes that are possible and think about what happens out in this tail of the distribution, in the bottom 5%, in the top 5%, things like that. And one of the first things that I try to get them to do is figure out, well, is this thing that we're trying to model, is it discrete or continuous? And once you choose that, well, then you at least have a clue as to how to narrow down what distribution might we try to apply here. So statistical models are important. I'll talk about later on in the presentation. I have a slide that talks about what are the important skills for someone who wants to start working in sports analytics. Now, maybe none of you are at that point right now where you want to, but you might have a child or grandchild who wants to do that. So it could be useful to you in that way. Go ahead. All right, let's talk about the different types of data in sports. So back when I was a kid, oh, okay, not the slide I was expecting, but that's okay. Let me just real quickly talk about data at a high level. I already mentioned it can be quantitative or qualitative. It can be structured or unstructured. There's often a lot of preparation work that has to go into it before we can actually do anything with it. But let's look at some data. Now the next slide. Okay. This might be a little bit difficult to read, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. Over here on the left, we see we have box score data. That's like back when I was a kid and, we used to have newspapers every morning. Actually, in the town I grew up in, we had a morning paper and an evening paper. But I'd look at the morning paper for the box scores to see how the Phillies, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, see how the Phillies had done. And we'd get what? Runs, hits, errors, maybe who got the win, who hit a home run or had an extra base hit. And that was about all we got, right? Back, 1970s when I was a kid. That's box score data. Then maybe 20 years ago, we started getting to play-by-play data. And I'll talk more about what that is here in a minute. And then we got to spatial event data and player tracking data. And you'll note that now we have video that underlies all of this. And I'm going to talk through what each of these types of data are and show you a few examples. Over on the right, this is important. So this slide actually comes from a friend, a guy named Patrick Lucy, who is the chief scientist at a company called Stats Perform. And he points out the fact that sports data is hierarchical in nature. Yes, we have this event that happened, but keep in mind that takes, maybe that's a play in a football game. That takes place in a possession or a drive that the team has when they have the ball, and which takes place in a match or a game, which takes place as part of a season, and so forth. So we have to think about the fact that data is hierarchical. You can't just all throw it into one big pile and analyze it. You have to think about the fact that there is a time series component here and this nested sort of structure. Okay. So here's an example of, box score data as it exists today. It's better than it was, in the newspaper when I was a kid. We can get this online. We could probably click on some of these hyperlinks and get some additional details. But if you think about it, what they're really showing us here are basic counting statistics and maybe a few percentages that were calculated from those counting statistics. And that's about it. That's box score data. And there's quite a bit of analysis you can do with this, but it's still limited. So people started saying, well, we need better data. So then they went to play-by-play data, which is on the next slide. Here you can see a basketball game between the Atlanta Hawks and the Philadelphia 76ers. You see that the game started with the first quarter with 12 minutes, and you can see at various points in time what happened on either side. You can see there's a jump ball. You can see who the two players were, who it got tipped to, and then it went out of bounds. And here's where the first points were made. The score changed from 0-0 to 2-0 or 0-2. Where Joel Embiid hit a 10-foot turnaround fadeaway for 2 points. But notice this is recorded in text. So you have to be able to process that in a way to make it useful. So we get the whole sequence of a game like this. And what this allowed was making calculations that would tell us things like, well, how well did a team do when this particular player was on the court versus when he or she was not on the court? That's what are called plus minus statistics, for example. So that let us do something new because it was a new type of data. Okay, then next we got spatial event data, which lets us make all kinds of cool graphs, like, where are people taking shots from and how good are they doing at making them? This one happens to be from the Houston Rockets after Daryl Morey became their general manager and basically put out the edict, you will not take a shot unless it's from behind the three-point line or basically a dunk or a really easy layup close to the basket. You got to wonder, did the guy who took that shot get, punished? Well, probably not. It was probably like at the end of a quarter or a half or something. But anyway, this spatial event data lets us do things like in the upper right there, the two baseball fields show where are the fielders positioned typically based on left or right-handed hitters, when they shift the patterns, things like that. Or in the lower right on a hockey rink, where are shots and passes taken from, and allow us to see patterns between different teams that our eyes can interpret, whereas if we were just looking at the tabular data, we'd have a problem. Speaking of tabular data, don't worry if you can't read the numbers, it's okay. You don't need to be able to. But this is what tracking data looks like. I mentioned having tracking data for basketball now. So there's 3 columns for the ball, the X position, the Y position, the Z position, and then there's 2 columns, just X and Y for each of the players. We don't track the Z dimension on them. I mean, yeah, they do jump, but generally speaking, their feet are on the floor. But But there you can see the X and Y position for every player and the X, Y, and Z for the ball. But if you or I look at this, I don't know about you, I can't make heads or tails of what's happening in the basketball game. Go to the next slide, and you should see this is that data converted into, an animated image file showing where are the players. The ball's the red one, it just got passed, now it got passed back, and eventually there's a shot taken. This is how we process information, right? But we can get the computer to do that from that tracking data that I was showing you on the previous slide. Okay. All right. The next thing, beyond just knowing where is each player, like where is their centroid or their center of mass, is knowing, well, what do they look like? Like, what does their skeleton look like? And you can hopefully see the green kind of, where are the major bones and the joints in their bodies, because that sort of information can be very helpful. So if we look over here at this one here of the pitcher, we can see that this pitcher is releasing this ball really low, for example, sidearm pitcher, or could even be a softball pitcher, but it's not in this case. But being able to display this is what's called pose estimation, and doing analysis of this can help us do things that we couldn't do until recently. I will tell you, we're using some of this with gymnastics at UF with video from past competitions. So this is exciting and new, and I will say my students are really getting into that project. Okay, so we have all this data, but how do we train the computer to understand the things that we know? So if you watch basketball, you've probably heard about this thing called a pick or an on-ball screen, and it's described in words here. We've got an offensive player who, sets a pick or a screen on a defender so that their teammate can, get around and either get an open shot or get a good pass or something. And, we know what it looks like if we see it. So for example, here's Alex Condon setting a pick on this defender when, who was that? Klavjar, I guess, had the ball last year in a game against Alabama. So we know what it looks like if we watch basketball. But how does a computer know what an on-ball screen looks like? Well, there's a bunch of code, it's a big if statement with a whole bunch of ands and ors and things like that in there. And it says, if all these conditions are met, and by the way, this exists for at least 13 consecutive frames, which if you think about it, if we have 25 frames per second is about half a second, and the ball handler hasn't changed, well, then we're going to call this an on-ball screen. So the computer will, basically, make an entry saying there was an on-ball screen at this particular point in time at 9 minutes and 18 seconds left in the first quarter. So we've gotten the computer to recognize things that we as humans can recognize in the past with rules-based sorts of things like this. We're now moving to the point, though, with some generative AI models where it can happen more automatically, where we don't actually have to give it all of this. So I'll talk a little more about that later on. So here's a quote from the Iowa State athletic director. He says, the power is not in the data. The power is in being able to tell a story with and about the data. And he's so right about that. The technical skills that people like me and our students have to do this sort of analysis is useless if we can't do this and tell a story that in coach speak that they will understand. Okay. All right. So I mentioned AI, and this is part of, I believe this is part of a broader AI series, right? Or you've been discussing it in a variety of areas. So let me talk a little bit more about AI in particular. So first off, what is AI and what is not AI in my mind? So AI is this big, broad field that lets, machines, computers simulate human intelligence and do reasoning and problem solving. Historically, the biggest piece of AI that I've worked with is what we would call machine learning, which is a subset of that lets our systems learn patterns from the data, and we use that to hopefully improve performance. A much smaller subset of that is what we would call deep learning or neural networks, where we're using more complex models. And this is what a lot of people think of as AI. Of course, today a lot of people think that generative AI, which is one application of deep learning, some people think that is all of AI. It is not. I'm still saying, hey, machine learning, which is honestly mostly what we're doing, is AI as well. Now, I would say that, simple things like, a simple linear regression shown there on the lower right, that is not AI in my mind. That's a statistical model, and it's still very useful, but it's not AI. Okay, so where are the opportunities in sports for AI? I would list four main categories here: performance optimization, which can get into training plans and preventing injuries, in improving efficiency of recruiting. We can use a lot of AI scouting tools. We can use it for fan engagement, which is more on the business side than the performance side. And then in general, just to support decision making. So here's an example. If we dig down into the performance and injury prevention things, I'll show you two examples here. The first one up in the upper right is this catapult system. So it's a little GPS device with an inertial movement tracker in it that the athletes wear, typically it's usually in a little pouch on a vest, like between their shoulder blades. We are using this at Florida in, I think, 6 sports or so. Another example here is down at the bottom is virtual reality training. There's a company called Rezzle that allows, wearing a VR headset and controllers and kind of like being in an immersive environment. There's a lot of personalized training programs that have been built to do this. In particular in football, quarterbacks use this a lot to be able to learn to read defenses and look at, where's there going to be an opening out there or not, or where should I avoid? Okay. I mentioned this idea of recruiting, and there's a lot of tools out there. Huddle's probably the best known one, but it automates highlight reels. If you want to, rather than having to go look at all the game film of a particular team or a particular player, it will collect and allow you to just look at certain types of plays where a player was involved. Another one here called Dark Horse lets colleges and universities know about students at typically smaller schools in maybe in some remote states that don't have a lot of coverage, where they might not send an in-person scout, for example. So making a big difference in recruiting. Okay, on the fan engagement and name, image, and likeness opportunities, it's creating personalized ticketing. I mean, you go to an event now, your ticket's on the phone, not a paper one that you get as a souvenir, but you might get some offers saying, hey, would you like to do this today since you're coming to the game? And so personalized ticketing, things like that. I mentioned this Signify, which is an interesting thing that the NCAA has recognized that student athletes are often subject to harassment online on social media, particularly during NCAA championships. So they've been collecting data and monitoring social media to identify that and hopefully, push back on that a little bit. And then there's this platform here, like Open Doors, that allows athletes, now that they can receive payment for name, image, and likeness, it allows them to see what opportunities might be available to them that fit with, who they are as a person, things they care about. So there's an example that is sort of an AI-based model. Okay. So decision-making, I kind of already mentioned, we're at the point where, real-time analytics during games to help optimize strategies. So for example, I don't know if you know this or not, but Coaches Challenges came to college basketball this year for the first time ever, starting on Monday. The game, Florida played against Arizona. That was the first time Coach Golden had the opportunity to challenge a call. Previously officials could go back and review calls and coaches could kind of, suggest that they do, but now there's an official mechanism for them to be able to challenge certain types of calls. So in college basketball, they can challenge, go back there, please. In college basketball, they can challenge, they can challenge goaltending, offensive basket interference, out of bounds calls, and some personal fouls, which are like charges and blocks in the restricted area zone, but they can't challenge any type of personal foul like they can in the NBA. Well, historically, at least in the NBA, some of those types are overturned more, more frequently than others. Well, we have that kind of historical data, and we're using that as a proxy to help the coach figure out which ones are more worth challenging or not. Because if you use your challenge and you get it right, you get another one. If you use your challenge and you lose it, not only do you not get another one, you lose a timeout, which has a cost. So we're helping do some of that kind of modeling and informing coaching decisions. Okay. All right. So I often get questions like, well, what skills do I need to have to work in sports analytics? So let me tell you a little bit about that. Like I said, might not apply to you, but could apply to someone you know. This is how I put together my team. So right now I have 34 students working with 11 of the Gators 21 athletics teams. Usually there's about 3, maybe 4 working with each team. And about 15 years ago, when the term data science first became, a thing or entered our lexicon, this guy, Drew Conway, came up with this conceptual Venn diagram that said, if you want to work in data science, you need to have knowledge of math and statistics, of hacking skills. Can you hit enter there for me? I think it should build. Yeah, or go to the next. Yeah. He said hacking skills. What he really meant was just coding skills. He didn't mean hacking in a black hat, nefarious, breaking into systems kind of way, to be clear. So math and stats knowledge, coding skills, and then some kind of subject matter expertise. Go ahead and build it one more. Like football or the sport for the team that you're working for. Well, in practice, finding somebody who's truly an expert in all 3 of these things is really difficult. I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I think I'm pretty good at each one of them, but there aren't a whole lot of people like me. And the people you do find who are experts in all 3 of those things, you typically have to pay them a lot of money, and they're likely to get ripped off by someone willing to pay them more money. So what has happened both in industry and then especially in academia when I'm working with student teams, because of the chance of me finding a student who's truly really strong in all 3 of these is slim. I have a couple of them, I'll tell you, and they're going to go far. But you find somebody who's really good at coding, okay in math and stats, and maybe curious about football. Then you find somebody who's a football expert who maybe is passable in the other 2. And you find somebody who's good at each of these, and you put them together and you ask them to do difficult things, and they usually will. They'll usually do a good job at it. So this is how I form my teams. Go ahead. So but in more depth beyond that, I want my students to have a knowledge of probability and statistics. I want them to understand some predictive modeling and some machine learning. They need to know coding, at least in R or Python. I don't really care which. I have a preference just because of what I've used more in the past than not. But you have to be able to clean data, or what you call munge it, combine it, harmonize it, pull together from different sources. You have to know a bit of SQL or structured query language, because a lot of the world's data still lives in databases, and we have to know how to get it out of there efficiently. The one math class, if I could tell my students to take, that most of them won't unless they're a math major, is linear algebra or matrix algebra, because so many of the models that I was already mentioning are based upon it. And once you kind of get a deeper understanding, it just really helps. I'm fortunate that the Army sent me to a graduate school for a master's degree in applied math, and then later a PhD in management science and statistics. And, I can build on that. But as I'm working with undergraduate students, they get some of this, but maybe not all. As I mentioned earlier, we can't just stop at predictive modeling. We need to move to prescriptive, which often involves techniques like simulation and optimization, things designed to, models designed to help us figure out what ought we do, what is the best thing we should do in this situation. And then the last part, but by no means the least important part, is this whole, communication and knowledge of the application area. This is all important. Oftentimes people will say, yeah, you got to have the technical skills, but you also have to have soft skills. I can't stand that term, because to me, soft implies easy, and communication with other people is not necessarily easy. But this is the list of things that I try to point my students to. And I get a lot of emails from high school students who say, hey, I want I want to do sports analytics when I get to college. What should I be studying? And so we have this conversation. I have kind of a standard list I give them. I don't tell them go do all these things, but I'll listen to where they're at and give them a suggestion or two. Are all of the sports analytics conferences that exist out there over the past year, just to kind of show you there's a lot happening here. The big one is the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference that takes place every late February, early March in Boston. They have between 3,000 and 4,000 people at that every year, so it's big. Most of these other ones are much smaller, more along the 200, maybe 400 people. But you can see that a bunch of different schools host conferences that are very good. I try to get my students involved in going to these to learn, to present. So like I just sent one student to the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference in Pittsburgh the other weekend. I expect to send some to the USF one down in Tampa. The one downside to that one is it always seems to fall the same date as the big one in Boston. And I kind of feel like I have to go to that one, even though I'd like to go to the easy to travel to one. All right, so my lab, I mentioned this. So I have the UF Sports Analytics Lab. It's that space that you see up there in the top photo. It's basically a repurposed faculty office that's decent size. It's pretty good size, but I've got a few desks, few computer workstations in there, a dry erase board here for one of my students to do some work on. But as I mentioned, I have 34 students doing work with 11 teams. Most of the teams come into the lab for an hour or so once a week to kind of have a meeting with me, update me on where they're at. But a lot of their work actually happens in a distributed fashion, from wherever they want to meet or online. You can see here the teams that we are working with. There's 11 out of the 21. Now that's a little deceptive. Track and field and cross country counts for 6. Indoor track, outdoor track, cross country, 3 for men, 3 for women. That's 6 sports. So out of the 10 we're not working with, cross country, track and field is 6 of them, okay? So I feel like I'm really working with way more than half of them. It's just the way the NCAA considers track and field versus the fact that it's all actually run by one coach. We're also not working with the tennis teams, and we're not currently working with the volleyball team. You may know that Mary Weiss retired after 34 years this past year, and they have a brand new coaching staff who actually are very analytical. But they said, hey, give us a semester or a year to just get our feet on the ground, and then we'll work with you. So I know we'll be working with volleyball going forward. I built a partnership with Athletes Unlimited. Anybody ever heard of Athletes Unlimited? It's a fairly new organization. They run 3 women's professional sports leagues in softball, in volleyball, and in basketball. At the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, happened to be there, was wearing a Gatorhead shirt, and somebody says, oh, you're at UF, what do you do there? And I told them, and he says, oh, I live in Gainesville too. I said, what do you do? I work for Athletes Unlimited. I'm the chief technology officer. I said, oh, that's cool. Not real familiar. What is it? And he told me, and so we said, okay, well, we'll get together when we're back in Gainesville. We come to find out we live a block and a half from each other, but I met him in Boston. We're going over to his house for dinner my wife and I are going over to have dinner with he and his wife on Saturday night. So they've become friends, and we're working with him. I had a student do an internship with him this past summer. We're doing a hackathon project to develop the schedule for their softball league for next summer. So working to build that. So not just with the UF teams. Had a couple of high school students in for the summer science training program in my lab. Historically, UF has used that more in the traditional science, like wet labs. But in recent years, they've started sending students to more computational labs as well. And I volunteered to do that this past year and plan to again. So likewise, if you know any, grandchildren or anyone who might be, interested in that, send them our way. And then got a website out there. It's honestly kind of underwhelming at the moment. Fortunately, we just got a new web developer into the College of Health and Human Performance who's working on it for us. Should be much better in a few weeks. We are on social media. In case any of y'all are, you're welcome to follow us. And next slide. I think this might be it. Yeah, that's all I've got for you, but I'm certainly willing to take questions too.
I'm Alan March. I'm a retired sports physician for the Gators and the Razorbacks. One of the teams that I didn't see were the cheerleaders. And having taken care of many injuries from many different teams, cheerleading was a risky sport. Can you comment?
Sure, I guess I would say I only listed the 21 NCAA Division I competitive teams. The other thing I would say is that keep in mind those other fields that I mentioned early on in the presentation, like sports science, biomechanical engineering, strength and conditioning. I would say that I'm pretty sure that those organizations on campus do much more work with them than I would. Again, thinking about the fact that I'm more focused on tactics and strategies, to improve performance, not necessarily the individual injury prevention and max performance from an individual athlete. So I see that as maybe more of a sports science and strength and conditioning thing, and I'm pretty confident they do work with them. Yeah.
Are there any colleges that you know of doing analytics for lacrosse?
So lacrosse is an interesting sport. I have a few friends who used to do lacrosse analytics when Major League Lacrosse was an existing professional league. It went away, and then there became, I'm trying to think, PLL, Professional Lacrosse League or something. And at the professional level, it's gone through some iterations, and I've seen a little bit of analytic work done in lacrosse. At the college level, I don't know. So I was at Notre Dame for 10 years before moving to Gainesville just about a year ago. And I was doing similar sorts of things there. Actually, my day job was I led our master's program in business analytics. And then I was the advisor for the sports analytics club as, an additional duty. I wanted to make that my full-time role. They weren't ready for that 3 or 4 years ago. So I left, went to industry, and eventually ended up here. But my point in telling some more of my story is when I was introduced to all of the coaches at Notre Dame, the then lacrosse coach, who has since retired after winning 2 national championships, was very, I'll say, old school and just kind of says, yeah, I'm not really interested. And so I didn't do any lacrosse at Notre Dame. My guess is that there are students and faculty doing some lacrosse analytics at, some of the perennially strong powers, at Johns Hopkins, at Maryland, at UNC, schools like that. My guess is it's going on. I've not been exposed to it though. And I've really not seen anything presented at any of the conferences I've gone to. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I'm betting somebody's doing it.
Fascinating. Who knew all this was going on behind the scenes? And you showed a slide titled Information Systems with a room with multiple screens. And at first I was thinking, oh, maybe they're using the UF Atlas Lab. But then you mentioned Florida room, I think it was 308. And I wondered where that room is with all the screens.
So that was an AI generated photo, actually. That was not a real photo.
Oh, no fair.
Meant to look impressive. There aren't that many screens. There aren't that many screens in Florida Gym 308, I will tell you. But actually, I have been in the Atlas Lab and have done a little bit of work with Nathan Carpenter, who leads it. For those of you who don't know, it's a social media listening lab where you can do analysis of things on social media. So, for example, last week I was in Atlanta at a conference. I was at the Informs annual meeting, which is Informs is my primary professional home. I lead the sports analytics section of Informs, which is like a little corner of 150 people out of the 12,000 in the larger professional society. And the presentation I gave actually was on some analysis we did about differences in social media, the focus of different social media posts about NBA and WNBA players and teams and how they're different. And in NBA, things are much more player-centric and focused on individual achievement, whereas in the WNBA, they're much more team-centric. So we've done some work with the the Atlas Lab actually that's related to this. So
I am also fascinated by this. Do you use this computerized system while they're playing? And how many other schools have the same program that you have?
So there are some uses. Most of the analysis, most of the modeling, the recommendations we make are typically prior to the play of games. I mentioned the coaching challenge one, which is something we've done recently, and we developed an app that can be run on an iPad that can be used there on the bench. They, after the game on Monday, came back to us and said, we talked about the high-tech route, we talked about the low-tech route, which the low-tech route's going to be like a couple of laminated cards that basically show, depending on the situation, should we challenge or not, very easy, very quick to read in the 5 to 10 seconds that they have to make a decision. I think we're going to try the low-tech route out for a couple of games and see how that goes versus the high-tech route. Higher tech isn't always better. That was one of your questions. There was another one, right? Oh, other schools. It's happening in different places, in different sports. I would say not as holistically as here. Notre Dame has actually kind of made moves in this direction. After I left and went to industry, they then decided, okay, maybe we should do this. And they hired a guy who I know and like and get along with to lead it. Had they been ready when I was there, I'd still be there probably. But I would say some schools are much further ahead in some sports than others. It shouldn't surprise you. Kentucky has an incredible basketball analytics organization. It shouldn't surprise you, that Alabama has a pretty robust football analytics organization. But I will say that there's no place that has kind of the holistic view like here. The closest place I would say is probably Syracuse.
When Todd Golden was interviewing, a lot was said about how much he used analytics in his sporting style. Was your lab part of what attracted him, and do you find him more receptive and using your input more than other coaches do? And second, how much of this information can be conveyed at the halftime when they meet in the locker rooms for both teams?
So I would say that Coach Golden and Coach Sapphire's willingness to use data and analytics in their decision-making is part of what attracted me to the University of Florida. The lab didn't exist prior to April of this year. They won a national championship in April of this year. I got here we moved here in December, right before the holidays last year, and I really started working on campus in January, starting to get to know people, get to know coaches on various teams. They were one of the ones who was certainly more welcoming and that we are further along with our work in. Others didn't get started until the summertime. So it kind of was actually the other way. Now, in terms of what can be done at halftime, it's pretty amazing what can be done with, they do have a new video review system available to them that they can use on the bench and in the locker room to, kind of look at what happened in the first half and make some decisions. But yes, we do have some dashboards that will be live that they can access if they choose to. We're doing the same for women's basketball. I will tell you that women's basketball is the team at Notre Dame that I primarily worked with most, because their women's coach was much more interested. Well, the women's coach, when I first got there, not so much. And when I approached her right after they had won the national championship in 2018, she could have easily said, no, we're good. But she said, okay, we'll give it a try and we'll see how it goes. And it kind of went okay for about 2 years. And then she retired. This was Muffet McGraw, in case you know who she is. And then when Neil Ivey, the current coach, came in after spending a year working in the NBA as an assistant coach, she came back and she was like, hey, where are those analytics people? I need them, because she saw what was being done in the NBA, and it became a pull system from the coach rather than a push, rather than us throwing stuff at the coach that we thought might be useful. When they know what they want, or at least have some idea, it works out much better.
I'm interested in the integration of these multiple data and multiple model systems. Do you have is there in any of the sports a program that basically asks the question, why did we win or lose this game?
So, I mean, systems thinking, systems engineering, in many ways is taking and decomposing a problem into component parts, which could be applied in this way, and I have seen in this way. Sure, there are models that attempt to look at, which were the most important factors in the outcome from a particular game. Some of that we know just from watching with our own eyes. If we watch the Florida-Arizona game on Monday night, we might have said, hey, we didn't rebound very well in the first half. We certainly did not shoot well, especially from three. I mean, we could kind of figure this out. There are ways, and maybe I should switch from basketball to football, but one of the questions is, okay, so if we gain 15 yards on a pass play, well, who gets credit for that? I mean, yeah, the quarterback gets credit for throwing the ball, the receiver gets some credit for catching it, but how do linemen and maybe other receivers and backs get some credit for blocking and things like that? As I talked about the different types of data, as we get to the more advanced types of data, it allows us to do some more attribution or division of credit to players and or to aspects of the game. So we're getting there. It's not a solved problem by any means, but there are people working in that direction for sure.
Nice presentation to begin with.
Thank you.
How fast is technology going till it becomes our offensive coordinator at the university?
So there were points earlier in the season where you would maybe be surprised or not surprised at how many emails or text messages I would get saying, why are you not providing, the head football coach with, here are the 3 plays you should choose between on the next play. So yeah, there's a lot of thought in that process. Not saying it can't be done, but again, it goes back to not trying to replace the coach, trying to provide another input to their decision-making process. There's a boundary there that I think we don't want to cross, but could we do better at providing better choices of possible decisions and eliminating some that maybe just ought not be considered? Yeah, we could probably do better at that. I don't know if it'll ever happen or not. We'll see. I'll tell you this, football coaches get paid a whole lot more than analysts do, though.
Second question is how might this view a player slump in baseball? If he goes 0 for 8, what do you call it? What's the probability if he actually gets a hit on the next one?
Yeah, so the whole streakiness, hot hand momentum kind of field, which is kind of what you're asking about there. One of the things I would say that we as humans do not do a good job at is incorporating or including the effects of just randomness and variability to the degree that it actually impacts our lives, to include our performances in sporting events. Some of the things that happen that we think, oh my gosh, this has got to be a tail event that only happens one in a 1,000 years, it's probably a lot more common than what most of us think. I mean, there are some exceptions to this. Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak being kind of one of the exceptions that I've done a bunch of simulation modeling of, and that's something that happens like 1 in every 2,000 seasons for somebody who's a 357 hitter. And oh, by the way, we don't have any 357 hitters anymore because pitching's gotten a lot better. I guess what I would say is just, there are ways to figure out how likely or unlikely an event is. One of the questions is, though, is that independence of sequential events, is that assumption that's often used in statistical models, does that actually hold or not? And there have been a lot of studies done in this area, and I would say they're inconclusive. Some come out in favor of streakiness and slumps, and others say, no, it doesn't exist. I don't know that we'll ever get to a real answer. Yes, sir.
The big question, in a direct confrontation, would Florida's AI beat Florida State's AI?
I think yes, but I've only been here a year. Keep in mind, though, we do offer the ability for faculty and students at other Florida public universities to access Hypergator, the supercomputer on campus. So they would have access to some of the same resources we have, but I don't know. I'd like to think our people are better, but I don't have any concrete evidence of that.
There are some questions online. The first is, successful teams have good chemistry among the players where they are team players versus me players. Can sports analytics take that into account?
Sure, I have seen some work done in this way. How do you measure, what is team chemistry? What makes players play well together? I mentioned plus minus statistics, for example. There's also a lot of what's done with lineup analysis. So for example, how does a team perform when this player is on the court versus off the court? How do these, in hockey, for example, how do these three players on a line perform versus a different three, or if we substitute one of them out? There are ways to test this based on historical data. The example I gave from hockey is one where at Notre Dame we had a very old school hockey coach, but one of the things we were able to convince him was with one of his defensive pairings that if he played, player A with player C instead of A with B, that it would likely result in better outcomes. And we kind of showed him with data why we said that. And he tried it. He switched about midway through the season, and it made a big difference. So there are ways to attempt to account for that in terms of who plays well together and who doesn't.
The next is, I'm reminded of the baseball movie Moneyball. Have you seen it? And if so, what do you think of it and the analysis used by the Oakland Athletics way back then?
So yes, I first became of Moneyball when it was a book, not a movie. I read it as a book, and I will tell you it's what got me and a bunch of other people into this field. Then when they came out with the movie and they had Brad Pitt playing Billy Bean, and then they had what's his name? Jonah. I cannot think of Jonah's last name. The actor who played Paul D. Podesta's character. It's kind of funny. People have introduced me as he's like the guy that that Jonah Hill played in the movie. That's his name, Jonah Hill. They're like, he's a better looking version of Jonah Hill. This is how I've been described. But yes, I've certainly seen the movie, read the book. What they did at the time, if you remember, was they discovered that on-base percentage was more important than batting average. There was that scene in the room where Billy Bean would look at Jonah Hill's character and say, why do we care about this? He gets on base. Didn't matter whether it was from a walk, whether it was from a hit by pitch, whether it was from, a single, he got on base, which if you think about it, how do you win baseball games? You score more runs than your opponent. How do you score runs? You get players on base and then you advance them around the base paths to get to home plate. And what he discovered was that there was a market inefficiency where other ways of getting on base, primarily walks, not so much hit by pitches, were being undervalued. People weren't being given credit for getting walks, and they were getting paid for getting hits. And he discovered a market inefficiency that he exploited because the Oakland A's were a small market team with not a big budget, but he found ways to play to a higher level than what they had been in the past. And a lot of sports analytics today is the same thing. And I don't mean everybody's focused on base percentage, but they're focused on finding what are inefficiencies, what are things that other people aren't doing that we can do. And just like in the financial markets, once information becomes available and people see what you're doing, other people are going to start copying it if it's successful. And eventually things will stabilize and it won't be an advantage anymore. And then you got to go find something else.
And the last question online is, are coaches using AI to call football plays in real time where the system calls the play? That's
not that I'm aware of. That sort of talks to one of the questions that I addressed earlier. To my knowledge, it's not happening. Many people have suggested it. I haven't seen any coaches willing to go that route yet, but maybe it is, and they aren't just aren't talking about it. I don't know.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you ever so much. This was fascinating, very interesting.